Today, we have 3 stories about people who each have like this one big thing in their life that brings them a lot of happiness and fulfillment and purpose. But unfortunately, this same thing winds up being the very reason that their life gets ruined. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, on the next really cold day, offer to make the like button a cup of hot cocoa. But don't use whipped cream on top, use shaving cream instead. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in June of 1993, a movie director named Xie Jin sat on a couch in a production studio in the city of Yinchuan, China. He was with a few members of his production team, and they were in the middle of auditioning what felt like the 100th terrible actor for the lead role in the film that he was directing. However, this was not an ordinary lead role. The lead role for this film was going to be a dog. So the movie was called An Old Man and His Dog, and it was based on this popular novel about a man living during a period of war in China with his loyal yellow dog. People had really responded to the story in the book because it captured just how devastating war could really be on rural communities. And a lot of people in China had seen themselves in the characters in this story. At this point, Jin had already cast the film's human actors, but the dog's role was by far the hardest to fill, and obviously the most central to the movie. He and his team had hosted a bunch of casting calls already and advertised to the public to ask if anybody had a dog that looked like the one that was in this book. And tons of people had answered this ad, but none of the dogs that they brought in were good enough for the film. And the reason for that is Jin knew, the dog needed to look the part, but it was more than that. Like, the dog also had to be compelling and charismatic despite being a dog. I mean, this dog was the hero of the story and the soul of the movie. So it really had to project loyalty and bravery and goodness on screen and sort of come across also as gentle and sweet enough that audiences fell in love with it. But now, as Jin watched yet another anxious, poorly trained dog actor scurry around the room, he felt this wave of anxiety. Jin was starting to feel worried that, maybe the reason all these dog actors were not working out is because maybe the perfect dog just didn't exist. And if that was true, then his movie would not be good. Like, he would have a bad actor in the lead role and it would flop. And for Jin, that really represented sort of like a worst case scenario for him. So decades earlier in the 1950s, Jin had been this prolific director in China, and he had won many prestigious awards. But during China's Cultural Revolution, which was a period of unrest in the country in the 1960s and 70s, Jin had been ostracized by the public because of his largely unpopular political views. And ever since then, he had been struggling to regain his status as a celebrated filmmaker. And so the chance to adapt this brilliant novel, which was touching and tragic and already beloved by the public, was like his opportunity to prove himself and get back on top. And he knew that, if the movie failed, he was old enough that he would very likely not get another chance like this, and he might be completely forgotten about. And so now, as this dog's audition came to an end, and obviously this dog was not going to be a fit, Jin's just sitting there feeling kind of hopeless, and Jin's producer walked up and led the anxious dog and its owner out of the room, and Jin at this point was so busy worrying to himself about how this movie was destined to fail now, that he barely noticed his producer bringing in the next dog and owner. But when Jin looked up, and he actually looked at the dog that was now standing in front of him, the 101st audition he was seeing that day, he just stopped and practically gasped, because sitting in front of him, right in the middle of the room, was now this new dog that looked exactly like how he had pictured the one from the book. It was shaggy and big and yellow-haired and had this eager-to-please look in its eyes that made Jin instantly feel like he was connected to it. The owner who had come in with this dog was a young, friendly guy in his 30s who introduced himself as Chung and he explained that he had just started a dog training and breeding company. And so having his dog cast in this movie would be a really big deal for his new business and would definitely help get his name out there. So this was like high stakes for him too. Now, Jin did not love the fact that, Chung had just begun this dog training and breeding business, so it meant that very likely he was pretty inexperienced with this dog actor. However, when the actual audition began, any worries Jin might have had completely vanished. Throughout the entire audition, Chung skillfully directed this dog like he'd been doing it for his whole life. And the dog was obviously really smart and followed all the commands. He was, really well trained. And it just seemed like the dog was really devoted to Chung, because it really did exactly what Chung asked every single time. But more than that, as Jin watched this audition, it really felt like this dog didn't just look the part, it acted the part. This was the dog he wanted in his movie. And so after only a few minutes, Jin stopped the audition and he told Chung, "You and your dog have got the job." They began filming the movie just a few days later, and basically as soon as they started, all the worries Jin had had about maybe this movie not doing so well just completely vanished. Because, just like he'd anticipated, this dog really was perfect. It obeyed his owner, Chung, without hesitation, same as it had during the audition. And the camera just loved this dog. The dog had this very sweet, tender quality to it that really came out anytime the actor playing the old man interacted with it, which is exactly what Jin had hoped for. And so Jin knew this dog was going to steal the hearts of everybody who saw it on screen. This was exactly what he wanted. And so Jin just disappeared into the making of this film. He poured all his focus, all his passion into each and every frame. And by the time production finally wrapped a few months later, Jin was sure they had just made a masterpiece. And Jin was right. The movie was released to rave reviews, and it seemed like everyone who saw it loved it. Not only was An Old Man and His Dog recognized as one of China's top films of the year, but also it was widely regarded as an instant classic worldwide. And so Jin knew that he had accomplished his goal here, and that his career now had a new beginning. A year and a half later, on an evening in late January of 1995, Jin was reading a script in his living room in the city of Shanghai, China. So the huge success of An Old Man and His Dog had meant that Jin was once again in very high demand, which meant he got lots of phone calls and people wanted him to read their scripts, and he was basically just getting to pick and choose what he wanted to do next. This was like best case scenario for him. So as Jin is sitting there, when his phone rang, because his phone again was ringing all the time these days, he assumed it had to be one of his producers who wanted to talk about one of the many scripts they were looking at. However, when Jin answered the phone, it was one of his producers. But what they said to him completely stunned Jin. His film, An Old Man and His Dog, apparently was being banned. Jin, when he heard this, he just sat there for a moment, unable to actually respond to this. This didn't make any sense. Why in the world would this wholesome movie about an old man and his dog get banned? This wasn't political in any way. This was a wholesome, family-friendly movie. So China did ban films with some regularity. Sometimes it was the content itself within the film could be viewed as being, unduly influential on the public in a negative way, and so that could cause the film to be banned. Or it could just be that the people who were in the film or the producers who made the film, they could have done something in their own personal lives that was viewed as being, unduly influential on the public, in a negative way. They could have had some scandal. And then because of that scandal, they could have their work banned. So the movie itself could be okay, but the people involved in the movie, they're bad, so movie must be bad as well. So that was sort of relatively normal. But Jin's film, An Old Man and His Dog, had been out for over a year at this point with no issues. It was viewed as this masterpiece. Everybody loved it. Everyone had all these great things to say about it. So it couldn't have been that. The movie itself clearly was okay. And Jin, he had had in his former life, he had been politically divisive and it had cost him dearly, but that was in the past. He had not done anything political, not in this movie, not in his personal life now. He had not done anything that was scandalous that could potentially warrant, this film being banned. And so Jin's what in the world could have caused this movie to be banned? What is going on here? And his producer said, you're not gonna believe it, but it's the dog. It would turn out A few days before the producer called Jin, Chung, the owner of the dog who had starred in this film, had been arrested for being a serial killer. Over the last 5 years, he had murdered at least 5 people. But that was not actually why this movie was being scrutinized. The movie was being banned because of how Chung disposed of the bodies of the people he killed. After murdering and dismembering his victims, he would take those body parts and feed them to his dog, the star of the movie. And so ultimately, the Chinese government banned this film because they knew from now on, now that the news broke about Chung being a killer and what he did with the bodies, that you couldn't watch this movie and watch that dog without thinking about the fact that that dog was eating people. Jin would go on to make a few more movies, but they never really worked, and ultimately his career kind of stalled, and he never reached the heights that he had hoped for. However, Jin had always hoped that one day he would leave a truly lasting mark on the Chinese film industry. And he did, because he'll always be known for casting a flesh-eating dog in his cinematic masterpiece. One evening in December of 1966, an 8-year-old girl named Elaine Ellery hurried after her parents as they walked towards this large factory in Norfolk, England. Elaine was so excited about the night ahead here that she was literally skipping as she walked along. So this factory was where her father worked, and they were having their big annual Christmas party. And for the first time ever, Elaine was being allowed to go, and she couldn't wait to see what was inside. So Elaine was really close with her dad, because even though he worked very long hours, he always went out of his way to spend time with her and make her feel very special. In fact, during the work week, it wasn't uncommon for her dad to come home over his lunch break just to give his daughter a big hug, and so they could quickly eat together before he had to rush back to work. And so now, after hearing about her dad's amazing factory over countless lunches they spent together, Elaine, for the first time ever, was actually going to be able to see what he was talking about, because to this point, she had never even stepped foot inside of the factory. Finally, Elaine and her parents arrived in front of this big factory, and in the doors they went, and immediately Elaine is like totally struck by just how truly incredible this place is. I mean, it was huge inside. It was already packed with people who were chatting about. There were all these other coworkers and their kids and their families, and Christmas music was playing, and all she could smell was apple cider and baked goods. And she looked around and she saw the whole interior of this great entry room they had walked into was beautifully decorated for the holidays. There was tinsel and there were all these things hung up everywhere, and there was even fake snow all over the place to give it like a true Christmas vibe. And so Elaine, I mean, she had really high expectations of how grand this place was going to be, and so far, it had more than lived up to its expectations. I mean, this was really like an incredible thing. So she was delighted, and the whole night she just ran around the party holding her dad's hand, looking at the machines and meeting his coworkers and eating all these treats. I mean, it was really just an incredible time. I mean, the evening was a whirlwind for her, and before she knew it, Elaine was exhausted and back in the car, driving home, drifting off into a very happy sleep. The rest of Elaine's childhood was very charmed. I mean, basically, she and her dad stayed very close. You know, they went to that Christmas party every year after that first time she went, and it was always such a fun event. And Elaine and her dad continued to have those lunch breaks during the work week. And, you know, by the time Elaine was getting old enough to start thinking about, you know, starting a family of her own, she thought hard about the values that her father had instilled in her. One was her dad clearly worked very, very hard. And the second one was her father clearly prioritized family over everything else. You know, as inconvenient as it was for him to come home on his lunch break practically every day, you know, taking a break from, you know, backbreaking work in the factory, he still did it because he wanted his daughter to feel prioritized and special. And so she knew when she had a family of her own, she would act like her father. So you can imagine how Elaine felt in 1983 when Elaine was 25 years old, and by this point, she'd gotten married, she had 2 kids of her own, she was living up to the example her father had set for her. You can imagine how she felt when that year her father passed away. I mean, for Elaine, this was like earth-shattering. I mean, she knew he was getting older, and It wasn't wholly unexpected that he passed, but for Elaine, I mean, this truly was like devastating. I mean, her father was like her rock. She had really modeled her whole life on her dad. However, after that initial really intense grief period ended right after the death of her father, Elaine was able to, have a moment of reflection, and she realized that, as devastating as it was that he was gone now, in a way, because of the way she had built her life, prioritizing family and, living like her dad, that in some ways, even though he was gone physically, spiritually, he was very much still with her and always would be. Fast forward 41 years to one afternoon late in the summer of 2024. And Elaine, who was now in her late 60s, was sitting at her kitchen table in her Norfolk home reading the newspaper. So Elaine had retired just a few years ago, and so now her life was pretty much exclusively about her family and about, slowing down and truly being retired. And in some ways, the timing couldn't have been better for her to start slowing down because lately, Elaine had been feeling absolutely exhausted, which was odd because Elaine felt like, even though she viewed her retirement as a chance to slow down, that she would likely have more energy because she wasn't working anymore. And so her slowing down would sort of be by choice, not because she literally couldn't keep up anymore. But lately, it was like Elaine had zero energy. It's like all she could do was sit in place and either read or call her kids, and that was basically it. But on this particular day, as Elaine just sat in the kitchen reading the newspaper, despite not physically really doing much at all, she suddenly started to feel winded, like she had been running around or something, like it was hard to catch her breath, and it scared her. She put the paper down and she sat there for a minute trying to calm herself down, telling herself this is just like a panic attack or something. But it didn't go away, and she really was struggling to breathe. And so she decided she would get up and go get a cup of water and just, take a sip of water and calm down. But when she stood up and began walking over to the sink to get water, like this sensation she was having just got worse and worse. And by the time she was at the counter, she's like holding on to it just to stay up on her feet. And she's trying to sip the water, but she's still like unable to breathe. And she realized that this, combined with this, recent really intense fatigue, meant something had to be wrong here. Like this was not something she could just write off. And so she hobbled her way over to the phone, she picked it up, and she called her doctor. Not long after, one of Elaine's children came by, picked her up, and drove her to the hospital. And by this point, Elaine, she had calmed down a little bit, but still that experience of really not being able to breathe really had shaken her up. And so Elaine, she goes into the doctor's office and she sits down in the exam room and she explains to her doctor what's been going on and what just happened that day. And not long after that, her doctor got a series of tests done, and eventually Elaine got an answer from those tests that explained all of her symptoms. However, that answer made Elaine look at her childhood, her charmed childhood, in a completely new and disturbing way. It would turn out, decades earlier, Elaine's father really had been setting a great example by working very hard and always prioritizing his family and always prioritizing his daughter. But what her father didn't know at the time, in fact, many people didn't know at the time, was that his work itself was actually putting his family at risk. At this time in the UK, most factories, like the one Elaine's father worked at, made products that contained asbestos. So asbestos is a substance that was used very widely for decades to construct structures primarily, like in construction it was used a lot. In fact, it was so common that basically any house or building built before the year 2000 likely was made with asbestos inside of it. And so when Elaine was growing up in the 1960s, asbestos was, naturally still being used all the time, and her father obviously encountered it daily at his work. But even though they didn't know it at the time, this was a huge problem for Elaine and her family, and really for anybody else who was living a life that was similar to theirs. Because asbestos was eventually found to be highly toxic and known to cause a very specific type of very aggressive and very deadly cancer that can sometimes take decades to develop. It was the very kind of cancer that Elaine's father had died from in the 1980s. And unfortunately, it was the very kind of cancer that Elaine was diagnosed with in 2024 following that, difficulty breathing and fatigue spell. And then she would eventually die a year later in 2025 from that cancer. And so in a tragic twist of fate here, Basically, it was because of how close Elaine was with her father growing up that she ultimately contracted the same disease that he did. I mean, there's no question he got that cancer because of his exposure to asbestos in the factory. But he would come home from the factory, like over lunch, he'd come home and he'd have lunch with Elaine, and he wouldn't change. He'd give her a big hug. They'd have their lunch break together. He's putting asbestos on his daughter, not knowingly, but he's covering her in this toxic substance. And then when he would bring her to the Christmas party, all that white snow on the ground was not snow, it was asbestos, but they didn't know it was toxic. And so ultimately, it really was because of how much she loved her dad and how much he loved her that ultimately killed them both. Around 9 p.m. on January 18, 2015, a 68-year-old man named Dennis Antiporak stood at his kitchen counter in North Miami Beach, Florida, writing a note. And this note was for his wife and for his adult daughter, Laura, who lived with them. And all he was doing was letting them know that he was going to be stepping out, but he'd be back in a couple of hours. Now, for Dennis, it actually was not that unusual for him to go out this late at night. This was kind of routine. He would often leave the condo where they lived, and he would go down the street to this diner called Denny's, which is a big chain in America. And he would hang out there with his friends, stay there for a couple of hours, and then he'd come back home. And tonight was going to be no different. His plan, as he said in this letter, was to go to Denny's. However, there was one stop he wanted to make before he headed out to Denny's, and he made that clear in his note. He basically provided his loved ones with his evening itinerary. So after finishing the note, Dennis left it on the counter, he grabbed his things, and then he walked out the front door of the condo. Several hours later, around 2 a.m., Dennis's daughter, Laura, paced around the living room of the family's condo with her cell phone to her ear. So she and her mother had gotten home around 10, so an hour after Dennis had left, and they had found Dennis's note on the kitchen island. But now, it was getting really late, and from the note, it seemed an awful lot like he would have been back by now. And so now Laura was trying to call her dad to figure out what was going on. However, every time Laura dialed her dad's number, it just went straight to voicemail. And so again, now that it's like 2 a.m. and she's starting to worry about her dad, she knew that he had gone to Denny's, the diner down the road. And so she looked up the number for that restaurant. It was open 24/7. And she called the Denny's. However, when a worker at Denny's answered the phone and Laura asked them, hey, is my dad there? Because by this point they would know him. He went there all the time. The worker said no, he hadn't been in at all the whole night. And so after hearing this, Laura was baffled. Like, where else could her dad be? But then she remembered the note, because her dad said before he was going to go to Denny's, he was going to make a pit stop. And so she looked at the note again, and she was like, that's where he has to be. He's got to be upstairs. So upstairs in this condo complex was a whole bunch of amenities that this place offered for its residents. There was a big gym and a pool, and there were common areas and relaxation rooms and all these different things up there. And Dennis loved going up there. And in his note, he indicated that's where he was going to go and go relax for a little bit before going out to Denny's. And so Laura, she heads upstairs, and the first place she looks is the gym. But the gym was totally empty. No one's up there working out at 2 in the morning. It was vacant, and her dad's nowhere to be found. And then from the gym, she went to the pool area, and the pool was closed, but she could look into the pool area itself, and there was no one in there, including her dad. He was not in the pool. But then Laura looked from the pool over to this door that was near the pool area that led to one of those relaxation rooms that this condo offered its residents. And in her dad's note, he had indicated he was going up there to, relax. And so she walked over to the door, she tried the handle, it was unlocked. She pushed it open, and immediately she was hit with this overwhelming smell. She nearly gagged, and then she looked up, and she saw her dad. So this condo had a whole bunch of different ways for their residents to unwind and relax. They had these relaxation rooms. They had mindfulness rooms and meditation rooms and yoga rooms. They had the pool, they had the gym, and they had Dennis's favorite relaxation room, which was actually just a sauna. So earlier that night, Dennis went into the sauna, expecting to be in there for a short amount of time to just relax, basically. A sauna, all it is just a closed space that gets really, really hot inside, and you sweat, and you just kind of sit there and just allow your body to kind of like melt a little bit and relax, and then you get out again, you feel very refreshed. But it's critical that you only stay in for a limited amount of time because you're effectively inside of an oven. And Dennis, he went into the sauna, no one else is in there, he set the timer for when it should shut off, and he fell asleep inside the sauna. And then the timer malfunctioned, and so the sauna didn't turn off. And so he's asleep in the sauna, it's just cooking him over and over again until he actually has a heat-induced heart attack and he dies, but then nobody knew he was in there, and the sauna's still on, and so he's dead in the sauna, basically just cooking for hours and hours and hours, until finally his daughter Laura went up there, opened up the sauna door, and found her dad, who by this point was literally charbroiled. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In December of 1990, a very concerned father was pacing around his kitchen, hoping that his daughter would call. But the phone stayed silent. And as it did, an anxious pit formed in his stomach. He was really worried about his daughter. He thought maybe she was in trouble. And also he was worried that he himself might have accidentally just done something that could make things even worse. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please hack the Like Button's Facebook account and delete their date of birth so that nobody wishes them a happy birthday. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of Friday, December 7th, 1990, a 39-year-old woman named Janet Dennis set 4 dinner plates on the kitchen table at her home in a suburb of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. She had just finished making dinner for herself and her 3 kids, who at the current moment were watching a Christmas movie in the living room. Janet hummed along to the TV as she brought the food over to the table, and then she called her kids to come over and eat. The kids got up, they rushed over, they sat down, and as they began eating, Janet told them about all these fun holiday plans that she had made for them over winter break. So Janet really loved Christmas. She typically would decorate her house like the instant Thanksgiving was over. And earlier that same day, she had gone to a toy store and filled the entire backseat of her car with gifts for the kids. But Janet really wanted this Christmas to be especially memorable for her kids, because the past few months had been really tough on them. Back in July, Janet had divorced their father, Leroy, and so now the kids only saw their dad about once a week. Now, Janet knew the kids missed him terribly, but actually, Leroy had never really been a very present father, which was part of the reason that Janet had asked for the divorce in the first place. They'd been married for 16 years, and for most of that time, Janet had pretty much felt like she was just a single parent, on top of being the primary breadwinner for the family. And this was because Leroy owned and operated this ranch that was located about 90 miles away in a rural town called Sealing, and this ranch really had never made much money. And so Leroy had begun working all these crazy long hours to basically avoid hiring extra help, but because of that, he was usually gone before sunrise every single day, and he didn't get home until very, very late. So he's gone all the time working, but for not much return, not much money. And so for years, Janet had picked up the slack. She worked as a school nurse. That way she could, make some money. And then also she could be home to meet the kids after school every single day. And then when she was home, she managed the house by herself as well. And so that was ultimately really why a judge awarded her full custody of the kids back in July when the divorce was finalized. I mean, Leroy undeniably loved his kids, but he simply couldn't provide for them. And besides, at this point, he was now living on that ranch in Sealing 90 miles away full-time, And so, his kids' schools and social lives were here in Oklahoma City. It wasn't a match. And so now Janet put another serving of mashed potatoes on her plate, and as she did, she reminded her 12-year-old son, Tad, who was her oldest child, that he had a wrestling tournament at school in the morning, and that they had to leave really early so they could get to the competition on time. After dinner, Tad helped his mom clear the table, and then they all went out to the living room to finish watching that Christmas movie together. And then when it was over, Janet followed her kids upstairs and helped get them all ready for bed. And then once they were all tucked in, she came back downstairs to finish cleaning up the kitchen. Now, this was about the time that Leroy, if they were still married, would be coming home from work. But now that Janet was divorced, she got to spend her evenings however she wanted. She thought about heading out to the garage to grab all those gifts she had purchased out of the car and bring them in to wrap them. But then, as she was about to head out, she saw a pair of headlights pull into her driveway. At 5:30 the next morning, Janet's 12-year-old son, Tad, shut off his alarm clock and rolled out of bed to get ready for his wrestling competition. Once he had his stuff together, he went downstairs, expecting to find his mother in the kitchen already making breakfast. But he didn't see her in there. So he just went down the hallway to her bedroom, and he opened up her door and he looked in, and there was his mom, still lying in bed with the covers pulled all the way up over her head. So Tad, thinking this whole thing was a little bit odd because his mom was all over everything, he still called out for her to wake up because it was time to get ready to go. But his mom didn't move. And so he walked into the bedroom right next to the bed and pulled down the covers to shake her awake. But when he did that, he realized his mom is not in the bed at all. What he was looking at underneath the covers was actually a pile of pillows arranged to make it look like she was still sleeping in bed, which was really weird because to Tad, it now seemed pretty obvious that his mother had actually left the house, but for some reason, she seemed to want him to think that she was still home. And so just to make sure, Tad left the bedroom and ran to the garage to check. And sure enough, his mother's car was gone. And now Tad, he really didn't know what to do, because in his entire life, his mother had never just left without telling him. And so Tad went back to the kitchen and he looked over at the clock on the oven and saw it was already 6 a.m., which meant he was already going to be late to his wrestling tournament. He wondered if maybe his mom had just run out to the gas station or something quick like that and she'd be home any minute. But a few more minutes passed by and she still didn't come home. And so at this point, Tad was becoming really anxious and he started to worry that his mom had maybe gotten into a car accident or something. So he did the only thing he could think of. He went over to the kitchen phone and he called his dad, who was out at the ranch in the ceiling. And when his dad picked up, he told him everything that was going on. Now, Leroy was, admittedly sort of confused by this whole thing, but he told his son, don't worry, your mom's going to be home any minute, I'm sure of it. But he also told him that just in case, he would start driving over to their house right now, just to make sure everything was okay. 2 hours later, Tad heard the sound of his father's truck pull into the driveway. And the instant he heard it, he jumped off the couch to go unlock the front door. When his dad walked into the house, the first thing he asked his son was, is Mom home? And Tad said, no, she's still not here. Leroy nodded, but reassured his son that, his mom was going to be home soon, that she would have a good explanation, it's okay. But, as Tad followed his father all around the house at this point, basically looking for Janet and looking for any sign of maybe where she had gone, Tad began to notice a look of concern growing on his father's face. And that sort of gave Tad this sick feeling in his stomach that maybe something's really wrong here. And then, sure enough, at some point, his dad, after searching the whole house and just sort of standing there for a moment, he turned to Tad and he said, we got to call the police. 2 days later, on Monday, December 10th, Lieutenant Detective Craig Gravel with the Oklahoma City Police District knocked on the door to Janet Dennis's house. He had spoken on the phone that morning to Janet's ex-husband Leroy, and now he heard Leroy's voice again, but from inside of the house right in front of him, calling to his kids to go on upstairs for a minute. And then a moment later, the door opened and Leroy invited Gravel inside. So even though it had been 2 days now since Leroy had called 911 and reported Janet missing, Gravel had only just been assigned to her case that morning. His captain had wanted to wait out the weekend before investigating formally because there had been no signs of violence at her home, and generally speaking, most adults who get reported missing show up within 48 hours. But that morning, when the case landed on Gravel's desk and he had begun reading over the details, his gut told him that something had happened to her. From all appearances, she was a very responsible and loving mother with no history of just disappearing like this. So, Gravel had immediately put out an alert to all the police stations in the area to be on the lookout for Janet's car, which was a red Chevy Blazer. And then he had called Leroy and asked if they could speak. And so now, Detective Gravel stepped inside of Janet's home, and right away he noticed how tidy and how covered in Christmas decorations it was. I mean, the whole house seemed so festive, which made Gravel think that Janet very likely had planned to be home for the holidays. And so he followed Leroy into the kitchen. They sat down at the table, and the first question he had for Leroy was, "Have you heard from Janet since we spoke this morning?" But Leroy said no. He said all he knew was that Janet had disappeared at some point between maybe 9 p.m. on Friday night when the kids went to bed, and they had seen her when they went to bed, and 6 a.m. the next morning when Tad had called him saying, "Mom's not here." And Leroy said, despite the fact that, Janet is his ex-wife and there wasn't a whole lot of love lost there, he said he was really worried because Janet would never just leave their kids alone. Never. However, he did tell the detective that while he had been just walking around the house for any clues about where she might have gone, he said he had noticed that her toiletries bag was gone. So now he didn't really know what to think. That sort of did suggest that maybe this was planned, but just very out of character. Gravel nodded and then asked Leroy could he think of any place that Janet might go to, maybe to go blow off steam or something, like some place if she was really stressed, where would she go? Leroy said, in the past, Janet had gone to Las Vegas to gamble, but again, she would never just go without warning and also would never just leave the kids unsupervised. Leroy said, at a minimum, she would have let him know if she was going away because, again, they have kids together. Even though they were divorced, they still basically were on decent terms. Gravel nodded and wrote down everything Leroy said. Now, to him, Leroy was definitely a suspect, but at this moment, he seemed to be cooperating. So Gravel wrapped up the interview and headed out because for right now, what he really wanted to do was go speak to another person who had also called the police station that weekend about Janet Dennis. Later that morning, so on Monday, December 10th, 1990, Detective Gravel pulled up to the home of Arthur Olson, who was Janet's father. Arthur had also called the station that weekend repeatedly to ask if any progress had been made on his daughter's case. When Arthur opened his door, he looked frazzled, and he asked if Gravel had found his daughter yet, or had any idea where she might be, or if she was okay. Gravel told Arthur that no, they still did not know where she was yet. However, he said that Leroy had told him that occasionally Janet would go to Las Vegas to gamble, to blow off steam. But Arthur echoed the same sentiment as Leroy when he brought this up, which is like, yeah, Janet would occasionally go to Las Vegas, but she would never do that without first making sure her kids were okay. She would never just leave in the middle of the night. That is not something she would do. And also, Arthur said, if she had gone to Vegas, like if that's where she was now, she wouldn't be alone. She would have gone with her new boyfriend. And when Arthur said this, that caught Gravel by surprise. Because Leroy, the ex-husband, had definitely not mentioned a new boyfriend. In fact, no boyfriends had been mentioned at all. And so Gravel asked Arthur to tell him more about this boyfriend, because this is the first he was hearing of him. At which point Arthur said, well, my daughter's actually been keeping this boyfriend a secret, both from Leroy and from the kids. Arthur said the guy's name was Jim Umbenhauer, and he was a soldier stationed at Fort Sill, which was an army base just a few towns over. But then this look of regret crossed Arthur's face. He told Gravel that he had actually only just met Jim for the first time this past weekend, after Janet was already missing. And the reason he met with him is he gave Jim a key to Janet's house. Gravel at this point looked up from his notepad and asked Arthur, what does that mean? Why did you do that? Now, Arthur went from looking regretful to looking straight up embarrassed as he explained. And he told Gravel that just a few hours after Janet was reported missing, Jim had actually called him. And Jim had told him that some of his belongings were actually at Janet's place, and that Janet would definitely not want Leroy to find those things because their relationship was a secret. So Jim had told Arthur that his plan was to wait until Leroy took the kids out somewhere And then when the house was empty, he would sneak in using the key that he was asking Arthur for, and he would just grab up all his stuff. That way, Leroy wouldn't find it. Gravel, when he heard this, was shocked, because to him it was like so obviously a bad idea for Arthur to have given Jim that key. Because as far as Gravel was concerned, Janet's house could be an active crime scene. But Arthur seemed to guess what Gravel was likely thinking here, because he said, he knew now that that had been a mistake. But back on Saturday, he just didn't believe Janet was truly missing here. Like, he expected her to come home. Like, this couldn't be a big deal, right? But now he said he was absolutely sick with guilt. Shortly after this, Gravel wrapped up their interview, and then he hopped in his car, and he drove right back to the station. His top priority now was to track down the secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. But as soon as he got back to his desk, he learned there was actually a more pressing lead for him to follow up on. Janet's car had been located at the Oklahoma City airport. An hour later, Detective Gravel turned his car into the long-term parking garage at the Oklahoma City airport. He was there to follow up on a lead about Janet Dennis, who had disappeared from her house overnight on Friday, leaving her 3 young kids unattended. And right away, Gravel saw another police cruiser at the far end of the garage, parked behind a Chevy Blazer. Janet's Chevy Blazer. And so Gravel, he pulled up behind the other cruiser, and then he got out and just began walking around Janet's car, getting a look. And eventually he walked up and cupped his hands over his eyes so he could look through the window into the back seat. And when he looked in there, he saw it was completely full of new toys, which he assumed were Christmas presents for her kids. And when Gravel saw those presents, he instantly had a bad feeling in his stomach. Like his gut was telling him that Janet did not drive her car to this location. Somebody else did. And also, at this point, Gravel also had proof that she wasn't in Las Vegas. So right before Gravel had come out to the airport, his team had called into this centralized database that could access all of the hotel reservations in the Las Vegas area, and there were no reservations anywhere in the entire city under Janet's name. Now, of course, she could be there with somebody else, maybe under their name, but this at least suggested, very strongly suggested, that she was not there. And so now, Gravel was confident that Janet had not skipped town for some spur-of-the-moment gambling trip. Now, at this point, if something had happened to Janet, well, Gravel's primary suspect at this point was Janet's new boyfriend, her secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer. However, Gravel still had not looked into him yet, which meant if he was involved in any way in Janet's disappearance, well, by now, he could be anywhere. And so as Gravel is thinking about this, he was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. And he turned and he sees a car pull up right behind his cruiser. And then after they parked, this guy got out wearing a full army uniform, and he walked over to Gravel and he introduced himself as Jim Umbenhauer. Late that afternoon, Gravel sat in an interview room at the station across from Janet's secret boyfriend, Jim Umbenhauer, and Jim was hooked up to a polygraph machine. So back at the airport, Jim had claimed that he'd been worried sick about Janet all weekend, and he'd been literally driving around town looking for her car. He claimed he had no idea that it, the car, or Detective Gravel, would be at the airport when he arrived. And it had just been like a total coincidence that he had just happened to find Janet's car at the exact moment police had found it. To Gravel, this felt like a fairly obvious lie, because the chances of Jim just running into Janet's car at the exact moment that police are finding it and that he's arriving to look at it, it just felt like not possible. And Gravel figured that Jim must have already known where Janet's car was and had somehow learned that the police had found it, and so he had just sort of shown up. Gravel knew it was actually common for killers and kidnappers to actually intentionally insert themselves into an ongoing investigation of their victims to influence the investigation or just keep a pulse on what's happening under the guise of being really helpful. And right away, Gravel had gotten the sense that Jim was doing just that. So Gravel had immediately asked Jim to not only come back to the station to talk, but to take a polygraph test. And Jim had agreed. And so now the polygraph examiner, so the person actually administering the polygraph, nodded to Gravel that they were ready to start. And so Gravel asked Jim, "Why did you ask for a key to sneak into Janet's house that past weekend?" Now, Jim looked genuinely surprised that Gravel even knew about that. But he told Gravel that he had simply gone over there to get a box of love letters from Janet's bedroom that were between he and Janet. He said that Janet had wanted to keep their relationship private, especially from Leroy. As a precaution, he had, asked Arthur to get the key to go in and get the letters. And he said, the letters were actually right now out in his car. Now, Gravel knew that would be easy enough to verify, so he just moved on. And he asked Jim, where were you on Friday night, which was the last night that Janet's kids had seen her. And Jim actually said that he had been at Janet's house that night, which caught Gravel completely off guard. Jim explained that he had gone over to Janet's house after the kids had gone to sleep so that he and Janet could secretly spend some time together. Now, at this point, Gravel really had to just stop for a second and collect his thoughts before asking more questions, because he really had not seen this coming. I mean, all day he had been trying to place someone at Janet's house after 9 p.m. on that Friday, and now here was Jim admitting he had been there at the house on that Friday night after 9 p.m., making him the official last known person to have seen Janet. After a minute, Gravel told Jim to just go on, tell me more about your last time seeing Janet. And Jim explained that he had stayed at Janet's house for a few hours and he had left really late to drive back to Fort Sill, because he was actually supposed to deploy to Afghanistan the very next day, but when he got back to base that night, he learned that his deployment had actually been delayed for a few weeks. So Jim said the next day he had called Janet's house to tell her the good news, that they had a few more weeks together before he went overseas. But he said Janet didn't answer the phone. A family member had, and they had said that Janet was missing. Gravel just sat back in his chair, taking all this in. To him, it just seemed impossible that Jim would be the last person to see Janet before she just vanished, and then he also just so happened to find her car at the exact moment the police arrived to investigate. So Gravel began asking Jim more questions, predominantly about his personal life. And it was at that point that he learned that Janet was not Jim's only girlfriend. Right now, he was actually living with another woman in a town closer to Fort Sill. Now, Jim admitted that he knew this looked bad, but he swore that the relationship with this other woman wasn't working, and he really just wanted to be with Janet. But Gravel, at this point, felt like he had heard enough. I mean, this guy really had dug himself a hole. And so what he really wanted to do was just discuss the results of this polygraph test with the examiner in private. So he ended the interview and sent Jim home. And once Jim was gone, Gravel turned to the examiner, and the examiner said, yep, Jim failed his test, which meant he had been lying throughout the interview. And this was sort of unnerving for Gravel. I mean, because this guy that he had just interviewed very likely was the man responsible for Janet's disappearance. But Gravel knew that he would need more than polygraph results and sort of a gut feeling to arrest Jim and charge him with some sort of crime. Right now, he needed more evidence. A few days later, Detective Gravel was in his office pacing around, reading through some documents. So after his interview with Jim, Gravel had decided to go to the school where Janet worked to speak to her colleagues about her relationship with Jim. Now, he didn't even know if anybody at the school would know about her relationship at all because she had basically kept it secret. And so Gravel had been really surprised to learn that not only did everybody at the school seem to know about Jim, but when they talked about Jim, they spoke with, huge adoration. I mean, they really loved Jim and thought that he was great for Janet. And on top of that, they all seemed to think, sort of collectively, that Leroy was a terrible husband and had been glad when Janet finally dumped him. They said Leroy was very argumentative and he was very controlling, and said the divorce had been really messy. And for Gravel, he found that kind of interesting because until that point, he had thought that Leroy and Janet were basically on good terms. But all of a sudden, it seemed like maybe that was not the case. So Gravel had gotten his hands on a copy of Janet and Leroy's divorce settlement, and those were the documents he was looking through. And as Gravel thumbed through it all, he saw that Leroy actually owed Janet a lot of money, $30,000 plus half of his ranch in Sealing. And that ranch, that was a really big deal because that was Leroy's entire livelihood. So to owe her half on top of the cash was like a huge deal. Plus, Gravel also knew that Janet had been given full custody of their kids. And so the way Gravel saw it, Leroy, he had a lot of reasons to be mad. And Gravel wondered if maybe he had been mad enough to do something to Janet. Just then, the phone on his desk rang and Gravel answered it. It was an undersheriff named Jerry Jones who worked in Dewey County, which is where Leroy's ranch was located. And he told Gravel that he had heard about Janet's disappearance and he wanted to help with the investigation in any way that he could. And he explained that right now there were lots of rumors sort of flying around Sealing that Leroy had killed Janet, and that one of Leroy's neighbors had spotted a big bonfire on Leroy's property just about at the same time that Janet had disappeared. The next day, Gravel was back in the interview room with the polygraph examiner, and this time Leroy was the one sitting across from the table from them, hooked up to the polygraph machine. Now, at first, Leroy definitely seemed nervous about taking this test, like he just seemed anxious. But as soon as they actually started, he quickly relaxed. It was almost like this was no big deal. Gravel began the interview by just asking him basic questions about his relationship with Janet and about their divorce. And Leroy would admit that he and Janet did fight a lot when they were married, and he said initially he had been very upset about owing Janet half of his ranch in Sealing. But he insisted that these days they were basically on good terms, and that he just really tried hard to focus on being a good father. And so not long after these sort of initial questions, Gravel asked Leroy to simply walk him through the night Janet disappeared. Like, tell me where you were, what you were doing. Leroy told Gravel that he had been at his mother's house that night, which was near his ranch in Sealing, and that the two of them just watched TV together and then they both went to sleep. This was the same story that Leroy had already given Gravel a few weeks ago when they first spoke, and Gravel had already called Leroy's mom and she had backed it up. Now, at this point, Gravel really wanted to ask Leroy about that bonfire that someone had spotted on his property. But he didn't want Leroy to know how suspicious of him he was. So Gravel decided that first he would check the polygraph tests so far to see whether Leroy had been truthful throughout the interview. So he asked Leroy to hang tight for a few minutes while he stepped out into the hallway and spoke to the examiner about his test results. Leroy was like, okay, great, yep, see you in a few minutes. But as he sat back down, Gravel could see he definitely looked anxious. And so Gravel, he went into the hallway and he walked over to the examiner, and the examiner told him that unfortunately, Leroy's results were inconclusive, which meant that he couldn't tell if Leroy was lying or telling the truth. And so feeling frustrated, Gravel went back into the room and just asked Leroy, hey, would you mind taking this test again? But Leroy, he glanced at his watch and said no. He'd been there for 3 hours already and he had to get home to the kids, so no, he couldn't. He clarified to Gravel that he had actually moved the kids from Janet's house in Oklahoma City back to his ranch all the way out in Sealing because the daily commute had been too hard for him. And so now he had a long drive back home and he just wanted to get going. He also told Gravel that he had heart problems. And so part of him didn't want to take the test again simply because it was too stressful and he was worried about his heart. Now, Gravel thought that was a pretty strange excuse. I mean, the kids were one thing, but heart issues being the reason you can't take a polygraph, that just felt a little fishy. But at the same time, he couldn't force Leroy to stay at the station. Still, he didn't want to come out of this 3-hour polygraph session empty-handed, so Gravel asked Leroy to do one last thing before he left, to sign a consent to search form which would allow investigators to come out to Sealing and search his ranch. And to Gravel's relief, Leroy said, sure. The morning after Leroy took his polygraph test, Detective Gravel made the long drive from Oklahoma City to Sealing, where Leroy's ranch was located, and where Gravel hoped to find the, at this point, body of his missing person, Janet Dennis. The previous night, Gravel had placed a call to Undersheriff Jones, the officer from Dewey County who had volunteered to help with Janet's case. Gravel knew that Leroy's ranch was over 1,500 acres, so it's massive, and that it would likely take weeks to search the entire property. So Gravel had the undersheriff's recon team actually begin that big search, while Gravel and his team began speaking to some of Leroy's neighbors. And so now Gravel pulled up a long driveway and parked outside of a big farmhouse, and then after he stopped, he got out and walked up and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a middle-aged woman answered, and Gravel explained who he was, and that he had heard that one of Leroy's neighbors had seen a huge fire on Leroy's property around the time that Janet Dennis had disappeared. And this woman's eyes immediately went wide, and she said that she was the one who had seen the fire. And it had caught her attention because there was a ton of smoke, so it must have been huge. Gravel felt the surge of adrenaline because he had this feeling that this woman was likely about to lead him directly to Janet's body. She was going to show where this fire was. But then a guilty look came across her face, and she apologized to Gravel, and she said, after I had told some people about this fire, I learned that actually the fire I saw had occurred a few days before Janet went missing. And for Gravel, this was truly crushing. But, he asked the woman if she had spotted any other weird behavior on Leroy's ranch, but the woman just said no. And so Gravel ultimately thanked her for her time and then felt completely defeated as he walked back to his car. Gravel spent the next few hours going door to door in the area, asking more of Leroy's neighbors about the rumors flying around town that Leroy had killed Janet. But pretty much everybody said that those rumors were largely connected to the bonfire that actually happened a few days before Janet disappeared, which meant that by the time Gravel headed back to Oklahoma City, he had no actual proof that either Leroy or Jim had been involved in any way in Janet's disappearance. He really barely had any evidence at all that a crime had even occurred. And even though he strongly believed that Janet had been abducted and potentially killed, it was still technically possible that Janet disappeared by choice and was alive and well somewhere. And so at this point, Gravel was completely out of leads, and he would just have to wait to see what would turn up on the ranch at the end of this massive search of the 1,500 acres. 6 weeks later, in early February of 1991, Gravel answered the phone in his office, and the person on the other end of the line said that they had information about Janet Dennis. And this was fantastic news, because at this point, Gravel's investigation had completely stalled out. Nobody knew what happened to Janet. She had not turned up. It was basically dead end after dead end. And also, so far, the search of Leroy's property, which was still ongoing, had yet to turn up anything useful for this investigation. The only other recent development in the case had happened a few weeks ago when Leroy had contacted Gravel about a box of Jim's belongings that he had found at Janet's house. Now, by this point, Jim was no longer a secret. Leroy knew about the secret boyfriend. When Gravel looked inside this box, he found this VHS tape, and it was a pornography tape. Now, it was not like homemade. It was not Janet or Leroy or Jim or anybody. It was, real actors in this pornography tape, but it was a really specific type of pornography. It showed this woman being tied up and burned. Fictional, but that was the script. That's how the pornography went. When Gravel saw this, he wondered if this tape was actually why Jim had tried to get the key from Janet's father to sneak into Janet's house, if the real reason for that was actually to try to find this tape, this, torture porn, and get it out of the house. And so Gravel had actually brought Jim down to the station to question him about the pornography tape, but Jim swore up and down he had no idea where that video came from, and he had even taken another polygraph test, and this time he passed. And so now, Gravel really didn't know what to believe, and he was desperate for really any new information. And so this caller saying they knew something about Janet was like the only positive development in the case that he had seen in quite a while. And the caller said that they actually had remembered something that might be important. And that's when Gravel realized that he recognized the caller's voice. They had actually spoken before. Based on forensic evidence and witness testimony, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Janet Dennis on the night of December 7th, 1990. Late that night, the killer was standing inside of Janet's bedroom by the side of her bed, just watching her sleep. And as they stared at her sleeping, the killer was just filled with rage. Even though on the outside, the killer sort of projected a very affable nature and just was a very calm and very kind person, inside they loathed Janet. And one of the primary reasons they hated her so much is because of her recent decision-making. And so after standing there, just taking in the sight of like the object of their rage, they reached over and grabbed a rag they had soaked in chloroform, which is a chemical that when it's pushed up against your face, it can cause you to pass out if you breathe it in. And the killer, they put this rag right over Janet's mouth until she passed out, because they didn't want her waking up when they inevitably moved her. And then after using the chloroform, the killer grabbed Janet's purse and then also grabbed her toiletries to make it look like she had chosen to leave, to go on a trip somewhere. And then the killer actually lifted Janet up out of the bed, put her on the ground. Remember, she's passed out from this chemical. And then they put pillows in her bed under the sheets and kind of arranged them so at first glance it would look like Janet was still in bed with the covers up over her head. This really was just in case one of the kids came into the bedroom in the middle of the night, they would look and see their mom and they wouldn't think anything of it. And so now, with the pillows in place and with the purse and the toiletries in hand, the killer scooped Janet back up off the ground and then carried her out of the house. And once they were outside, the killer placed Janet's unconscious body in the back of the killer's vehicle, and then they drove her to a nearby house in Oklahoma City that they owned. The killer took Janet inside of this home and tied her up so that even if she woke up from this chloroform, she wouldn't be able to escape. And then the killer drove back to Janet's house, parked their vehicle there, and used Janet's keys they had gotten from her purse to get into her Chevy Blazer. And then they drove her Blazer out to the airport and parked it in the long-term parking lot. Then the killer took a taxi from the airport back to Janet's house, where they got into their own vehicle again and drove back to the house where Janet was tied up. Then the killer put Janet, who was still passed out, back into the killer's vehicle, and they drove her to another house they owned. This one was outside of Oklahoma City. And when they got to this house, the killer dragged Janet out of the back of their vehicle, they put her on the ground, and the killer went and got a shovel and then came back over and smashed her in the head with it until she was dead. And then once Janet was dead, the killer burned her body in the fire pit on their ranch. Janet's killer was her ex-husband Leroy, who just basically hated Janet for getting full custody of their kids, for getting half of his ranch, for him being ordered to pay her $30,000. Like, he hated her and resented her for all that. And then when he found out she was also dating this new guy, Jim, he was consumed by jealousy and decided he needed to do something, which was ultimately to murder his ex-wife. And then after the murder, he invented an alibi and reported Janet missing himself in order to cast suspicion off of himself. But he was ultimately caught because Leroy's neighbor remembered seeing smoke from his burn pit. It was the same neighbor that Gravel had spoken to. She had first thought the fire happened after Janet went missing, and then she changed her mind and thought it happened maybe before. But then a few weeks later, she checked her calendar and realized she had gotten the date wrong again, and that the fire was actually the day after Janet disappeared. And so she called Gravel right away and said, "I have more information about Janet, and it might be important." And so later that same day, after getting this information, the search team out at the property, out at the ranch, focused their efforts on the burn pits, and they would eventually find Janet's remains. Leroy Dennis was convicted of first-degree murder and ultimately sentenced to life without parole. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to share 3 stories that are about real medical cases that are totally wild. And in each of these stories, the patient or patients appear to have no hope, like they are just doomed and nobody knows why. But eventually, when the doctor or doctors finally figure out what was actually wrong, it turned everything the patients and their families thought they knew completely inside out. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're at the Like Button's house, go ahead and secretly replace all of their hand lotion with mayonnaise. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One hot afternoon in May of 1891, a 31-year-old businessman named James Hatcher rushed through the small town of Pikeville, Kentucky. And as he made his way, he could feel people staring at him, because he knew he very likely looked crazy. His hair was totally wild, his suit that he had slept in the night before was all rumpled from sleeping in it, And he was swatting at all the flies that were buzzing around his head. Flies were very common in this part of Kentucky in the spring. But right now, James did not care what anybody thought, because his only focus at this very moment was just getting to the town doctor's office. Because in his hand, he held this legal document that he was sure would put an end to the psychological torture he'd been enduring ever since his wife had died. So up until very recently, James had had sort of a charmed, perfect life. Even though he was a pretty young guy, he was still one of the richest men in town. He'd made his fortune in coal and real estate. And in fact, he actually owned most of Pikeville, where he was. But more than having lots of money and resources, the real thing that had made him so happy and really fulfilled his life was that he'd had this great marriage to his wife, Octavia. And last year, they had gotten pregnant with their first child, and it just seemed like everything was coming up roses. But then 4 months ago, tragedy had struck. Their baby had died just hours after being born, and it was arguably the worst thing that had ever happened to James or his wife. That is until just last week, when Octavia herself had died. The doctor had told James that his wife had died from a broken heart, from losing her child. It had just been so much, it had killed her. And during the chaos of making the arrangements for the funeral and just grappling with this overwhelming grief, not only for the loss of his child still, but now his wife as well. I mean, his life is wrecked here. James had not questioned the cause of death. He had just accepted it. But after the funeral, when James was back inside of his mansion, now all by himself because his family has been wiped out here, he found himself just like unable to live. I mean, he couldn't sleep, he couldn't go to work, he couldn't do anything. All he could do was just pace around the mansion by himself, just obsessing over how in the world this could have happened. How could he have lost his child and his wife, a week apart? How could that have happened? He had a perfect life. How could this be? And the more he obsessed over this unbelievable loss, the more he began to question specifically how his wife had died. Because again, he had been told by the doctor she had died of a broken heart, but he was thinking, wait a minute, I just don't buy that diagnosis. Like there's gotta be something else. Now, of course, it was true that Octavia was completely devastated after losing her baby. I mean, she and her husband both were devastated. But people did not die of sadness, not really. I mean, they can decline rapidly, but to literally die from a broken heart just seemed impossible. And so now the question of what really had killed his wife was all James could think about. It was like instead of just grieving the loss of his wife and his child, it was like he needed to solve what happened to his wife for real. And pretty quickly, James decided that the only real way to figure out what happened to his wife was not going and talking to the doctor again or reading literature, about various symptoms that could have been hers and try to tie it to some disease or something. No, he realized that the best thing he could do is just go dig his wife up and have a look. So James had convinced a local judge to order an emergency exhumation, to dig up his wife. And the judge had said yes, and he had given him a legal document saying he could do that. And so that legal document was what he was carrying as he hustled through town looking totally crazy on his way to the town doctor's office. Because it was ultimately the town doctor who would actually examine his wife's body once the exhumation was complete. And so James, he finally reaches the doctor's office and he bangs on the door, and eventually the doctor opened up, sort of looking at this guy who, again, looks totally wild, frumpled suit, hair crazy, flies everywhere. And he's like, hey, what's going on? And James, he just hands over this legal document, the order that says he's gonna exhume his wife. And the doctor took the order and he read it, and he kind of looked up at James with almost like a look of sympathy on his face. Like he felt bad for James. Like obviously this man's life has just fallen to shambles here. Now, the doctor was clearly prepared to fulfill this order and to look at his wife's body, but he made a point of telling James that, digging up Octavia now just was not a good idea. It wouldn't change what happened, and it definitely would not bring her back. Like this is not the move here. But James knew all this, and he really didn't care about anything the doctor was saying because he wasn't trying to bring his wife back. He just wanted to know the truth. He had to. And so later that afternoon, James and the doctor stood by Octavia's tombstone as a pair of cemetery workers dug up her grave. And it was so hot outside that James and the doctor were sweating profusely, and these flies are everywhere. I mean, it's kind of a miserable scene here. But James, he was just kind of overcome by this sense of almost dread. Like he definitely wanted to do this, But he's realizing that any moment here, after these guys dig up this grave, that he's going to physically see his wife again, his dead wife. And he didn't really know how he was going to feel, like literally seeing her in the condition that she was going to be in, decomposed. But he knew this was the right thing to do. So he just sat there, swatting at flies, sweating profusely, just waiting. And eventually, one of the workers with their shovel, they dug into the ground and it struck something hard. It was the coffin. And so at that point, James and the doctor, they kind of leaned into the hole to look down, and one of the workers got to the side and lifted up the lid of the coffin, and inside was Octavia. But Octavia was not in the same position she had been in when she was lowered into the ground. She was sort of in this position with her hands up, and across the top, the inside top of the actual coffin, were all these deep gouges, like scratch marks on the inside of the coffin, and Octavia's nails were all flipped backwards. So shortly after James buried his wife, he's totally heartbroken. He's questioning, the doctor's diagnosis of what actually killed her. And in that period of time, over those few days after the funeral, there were several people in Pikeville that came down with a mysterious illness. They almost appeared to be dead, but it would turn out it was just from being bit by these flies that were swarming around everybody this spring. And so James, as he's thinking about his wife and what really killed her, he began to have this panicked thought that maybe his wife hadn't died at all. Forget the broken heart thing. Maybe she had just been bit by a fly and appeared to be dead, and now I've buried her. And so he had to get her up, exhume her, and check. And when he opened up the coffin, he saw he was right. She had not died of a broken heart. She clearly had been bit by a fly. She woke up underground in her coffin and slowly asphyxiated while trying to burrow her way back out again. Shortly after James had buried his wife in the ground, like in those subsequent few days, he noticed several people in Pikeville, where he lived, had come down with something they called sleeping sickness, which is something you get from being bit by one of those flies that are always buzzing around these folks' heads in this town in the spring. And, sleeping sickness sometimes can take the form of just having like a fever and being very achy. But in some cases, really bad sleeping sickness can cause people to drift into a coma for several days. Sometimes they wake up, but sometimes they don't. They die. Or others, like the sleeping sickness is so severe that it causes their heart rate to drop so low that they're not in a coma, but they almost give the impression of being dead. And so sleeping sickness basically mimics death and sometimes causes death, but some people do come out of it. And so James, he's seeing all these people have this illness, and he began to wonder, well, wait a minute, I'm already questioning my wife's diagnosis. What if something even worse happened? What if she wasn't even dead? What if she had just gotten bit by one of those flies and had sleeping sickness? And so in a panic, he has her exhumed, and when he opens the coffin, what does he see? All the signs in the world that his wife had not been dead, so she did not die of a broken heart. No, she was alive when she was buried, and at some point she woke up, but she was trapped, and she slowly asphyxiated while trying to claw her way out. She must have been bit by a fly and got sleeping sickness. One morning in early 2020, a 24-year-old woman named Rosa Sanchez laid in a hospital bed inside of a national medical center in Lima, Peru. And while she lay in her bed, Rosa was sort of vaguely aware of doctors and nurses and a small group of strangers sort of leering over her, staring at her like she was some kind of medical anomaly. But Rosa really couldn't pay attention to anyone right now, because right now she was feeling sicker than she ever had felt in her whole life. Her stomach hurt so much that it felt like she was rotting from the inside out or something. And at the same time she was having this awful physical symptom, she was also feeling incredibly depressed and overwhelmed with guilt. So just a few months ago, Rosa had been a happy, successful college student working towards a degree in economics. But then there had been this outbreak, this sudden disease outbreak at her school, and a bunch of students, including Rosa, had gotten sick with some kind of mysterious illness that still had not been identified. And Rosa had gotten so sick, she actually had to temporarily drop out of school and move back home with her mother and father and two little siblings. And it was at that time that something truly tragic and unimaginable happened. Rosa, when she came home, was still sick, and she wound up infecting her entire family, all 4 of them, and within weeks, they all died. Rosa's still alive, but her family is now wiped out from this disease that she still had. And so Rosa now is not only dealing with this horrific illness that feels like it's killing her, but she's living with the reality that, in her mind, she caused the deaths of her whole family. And so this is just like the worst possible scenario anybody could be in. And so now in the hospital, Rosa, who's sort of just totally out of it, she's racked with pain in her stomach. She could tell that a doctor had actually moved up right next to her bedside, and he began telling her some of the results from the recent diagnostic testing they had been running on her. And the doctor told her that, they had run all these blood work tests and they had done these imaging scans, but so far everything had come back normal. And so they still didn't know what was wrong with her. However, the doctor did say that he wanted to try a different kind of test that might be able to tell them a little bit more. He explained that since Rosa's basic imaging scans had come back normal, what he wanted to do now was try a more advanced type of imaging known as a SPECT scan. Before she could even ask what a SPECT scan was, he explained to her that what it would be is she would be injected with this radioactive substance, and then after that, they would have her lie down inside of this machine that could basically trace the substance as it moved through her body. Basically, this would allow doctors to not just look at Rosa's internal organs, but to actually see how they were functioning in real time. Hearing this, Rosa couldn't help but be a little weary of the idea of a radioactive substance being injected into her body. But at the same time, her life is in shambles. She basically knows this disease is probably going to kill her at some point, and so she was desperate enough to try anything. So she closed her eyes and just nodded yes, she would try this new scan. About an hour later, Rosa was laying on this long, thin platform right outside of the SPECT scan machine, which was like this big machine that was shaped kind of like a donut with an opening large enough for her to be basically slid in through horizontally. By this point, Rosa had already been injected with this radioactive substance, and now the same doctor who had suggested this scan in the first place stood right beside her and told her that the actual scan would only take maybe 30 minutes when she was inside of this machine. And all she would have to do during the scan was just lie perfectly still. So Rosa said okay, and then she heard the doctor leave the room. A moment later, the SPECT machine began making a whirring sound, at which point the platform that Rosa was laying on began moving, and she was brought inside of this machine, inside of the donut, and then eventually the platform stopped, and at that point she's just looking at the inside of this machine, which was just, white plastic all around her. And for a couple of minutes, as this scan began and Rosa's just laying there, being as still as possible, everything seemed fine. She had never done a SPECT scan before. But then, out of nowhere, pain ripped through Rosa's abdomen, which was already in pain, but this was a new pain. It was so severe. Like, she knew she was supposed to stay still, but she couldn't help but sort of lean forward from how much pain was in her gut. And then as she's telling herself to stay calm, she began feeling lightheaded, and she had tunnel vision, and she began to panic. She's claustrophobic. And then before long, her ears were ringing, and then it was like everything just kind of faded. Her vision went black, and Rosa died. And so the doctor, he's outside of the room, and he's hearing and seeing in real time Rosa basically dying. And so as fast as he can, he shuts off the SPECT machine, which immediately causes the platform that she is on to automatically go back out of the machine. And so as the doctor runs into the room, he sees Rosa just lying there on this platform, outside of the machine, and she's completely limp, like she's lifeless. But the doctor was thinking, the scan had actually worked. It told him exactly what was wrong with Rosa. What the scan had shown the doctor before Rosa died was that Rosa had severely low blood flow to several crucial areas of her brain. And this lack of blood flow was what had actually caused all of her symptoms. But this was actually really good news, because now the doctor simply leaned over Rosa, looked into her wide open eyes, and told her to please just go ahead and sit up, because Rosa was not dead. She just thought she was. It would turn out Rosa was suffering from 2 extremely rare psychological disorders. The first was known as Cotard's syndrome, and it caused Rosa to believe that she was literally rotting from the inside out, and then eventually that she died. She literally believed that she had died inside of the scanner. And the second rare psychological disorder was Capgras syndrome. It had caused Rosa to think that many of the people close to her, like her classmates and her own family members, had gotten sick and died from this mystery illness. And then they had been replaced by clones. The reality here was that there actually was never any disease outbreak at Rosa's school or in her home. The group of strangers in Rosa's hospital room were her mother, father, and 2 siblings. They were perfectly fine. As for Rosa herself, she was obviously mentally very unwell, but physically, she was never sick at all. Now, Rosa would need continued psychiatric care, but after 3 weeks in the hospital, she was able to go home with the family that she believed she had lost forever. In the spring of 1988, a 27-year-old woman named Severina stood in the corner of a small adobe house in the rural village where she lived in the mountains of Bolivia. The house belonged to a curandero, which was a traditional healer. Severina had come here with her 2 aunts because her aunts were sick and in desperate need of help from the curandero. So 2 weeks earlier, Severina's aunts had come down with these horrible fevers, and they had been in bed for days, and they had both been so tired and so weak that they could barely move or even eat. However, despite eating, both of their stomachs had swollen up like balloons, and then the skin on the outside of their stomachs had actually turned black, almost like the skin itself was dying. And it was at that point that Severina decided that her aunts could no longer afford to just hope this goes away on its own. They needed to go see a professional, go see the local healer. And so now Severina watched as her 2 aunts were told by the curandero to lie down on these mats in the middle of the floor. And both aunts they're very weak and sick, but they lie down. And the curandero, as they're lying down, lit incense and began waving it over their bodies. And then he inspected their faces and also their black stomachs. Then, a moment later, he turned his attention to this folded up blanket that was sitting near the aunts' heads. He took the blanket and he unfurled it and sort of laid it out in front of him, and then wrapped up inside of this blanket was a small pile of coca leaves. And the curandero, he picked out a few of these leaves and just sort of appeared to scatter them on the blanket. And then he appeared to study the leaves, like he was looking for signs that the leaves were going to give him. And Severina knew that these leaves were telling him what was wrong with her aunts. Finally, the curandero, after looking at these leaves for a bit, he looked up at Severina and told her that her aunts were sick with a blood curse, which meant that the blood flowing through their veins was literally cursed with dark magic. But that wasn't all. The curandero went on, telling Severina that this was actually not just a blood curse, but it was a family blood curse, which meant that someday she, Severina, would also get this curse and very likely die. When Severina heard this, a chill ran through her body, and she almost instinctively began scratching at her arms, like she could scratch this curse, out of her skin or something. But the curandero looked at her and just said, "There's nothing you can do. There's no cure for you or your aunts. Your fate and theirs is sealed." A few days later, Severina was back in her own home, in her own kitchen, making some herbal tea for her aunts who were staying in her guest bedroom. And as she prepared this tea, all she could hear was the sound of her aunts moaning in pain and agony in the other room. So Severina, as quickly as she could, she finished making the tea and then hustled into the guest bedroom. So over the past few days, after leaving the curandero's hut, Severina's aunts had gotten sicker and sicker and sicker. They now couldn't eat anything, and they were constantly so dizzy they could barely even lift their heads up off their pillow. And they both just seemed so weak and so depleted, and their stomachs were still black and bloated, and they had these agonizing stomach cramps basically all the time. It was obvious that they were dying. And their sickness had just been horrifying for Severina to watch on many levels. And so at this point, all Severina was really trying to accomplish was just doing her best to try to make her aunts as comfortable as possible until they died. And so now Severina walked over and she sort of assisted one of the aunts and had them sit up, and she tried to give her some of this tea that she had made. But when her aunt just smelled the herbal tea, she began to dry heave, and Severina jumped out of the way just as her aunt threw up bile all over her own lap. Immediately, the smell of this vomit and the smell of death and just the smell of filth that was filling this room, it just went right up Severina's nostrils, and she had to immediately run from the room and go outside where she vomited just from being so grossed out by being in that room. Severina felt completely overwhelmed by what was happening here. I mean, she obviously was just devastated to see her aunts in this condition. But what was even worse is it was like she was sort of watching what was going to happen to her, and she just couldn't believe it. And so she thought to herself, any day now, I'm going to begin showing symptoms that shows I too have this blood curse, and I'm going to begin withering away and then rotting until I die. And as she had this thought, she found herself again scratching at her arms as if somehow she could rip this illness out of her body before it took her life. Later that same night, after Severina had composed herself and gone back into the house, she had seen that her aunts did need more tea, and so she had left to go get more herbal tea remedies from the curandero. But after getting it and coming back to her house, she found that both of her aunts by this point had died. And the moment she saw them, Severina was overcome with both grief and also fear. Over the next few weeks, as she buried her aunts and grieved for them alongside her family, what she really was thinking about is, when is this blood curse gonna kill me too? And as months turned into years and still she didn't get sick, Severina began to wonder if maybe the curandero had been wrong. Maybe she didn't have this blood curse. Maybe it wasn't a family curse. But then, 30 years later, in the fall of 2018, when Severina was 57 years old, she woke up one morning with a stomach cramp, and she also felt very nauseous and a little dizzy. And even though by this point it's been 30 years since her aunts died of this illness, she knew immediately on that morning that the curse had finally arrived and it was now going to kill her. So she forced herself to get out of bed, and then she walked outside to where her husband and her daughter were sitting and having coffee, and she told them what was going on here. And when she told her family that she has this blood curse and there's nothing they can do, her daughter, whose name was Janet, said, "Wait a minute, Mom, go to a doctor." But Severina argued that there was no point because the curandero 30 years ago had told her that nothing would help, and she had watched her aunts die from this very thing. Like there was nothing she could do. She was doomed. But Janet begged her mother to just forget what you were told 30 years ago. Forget all that and just go see a doctor. Even if they can't do anything, just go. And eventually, Severina relented and said, "Fine, I'll go to the doctor even though it's not going to help." So later that day, they made the long journey into the nearest city to go see a doctor. At the doctor's office, a doctor took blood samples and ran tests on Severina and listened carefully as she explained the family blood curse. And as Severina and her family waited for the test results to come back, she braced herself because she knew that the doctor would say that, sorry, yep, the tests show there's nothing we can do here. And finally, the doctor did come back into the room and he told Severina that she was right. The curandero had been right. This was blood related. There was something in her blood. And immediately Severina just kind of collapsed in her chair because she knew what came next was an agonizing death, the same way her aunts had died. But then the doctor told her what this blood curse actually was. And at first, Severina was just really confused by what the doctor was saying. But then, as she's hearing this new information, she remembered all the times when she was younger, when she would reflexively itch her skin when she thought about the blood curse, like she would itch to scratch it out of her body. It was almost like this reflexive thing that she was doing, not realizing that every time she scratched her arms, she was quite literally giving herself the curse. It would turn out the so-called blood curse that Severina's aunts had was actually caused by a parasite. And it was true, Severina also had this blood curse. She too had a parasite in her body that would do the same thing. But Severina's parasite, it went dormant inside of her body for more than 30 years. So no symptoms, nothing for 30 years, just living inside of her skin. In many parts of South America, there is a bug called the vinchuca, which is essentially a type of bed bug. The bug itself is harmless, but there's a parasite that lives in the bug's feces. When the bug bites its victims, and its victims scratch at the bites, they break the surface of their skin and infect themselves with this parasite. Then the parasite can lay dormant in the person's blood, sometimes for decades. Now, a lot of people don't even realize they have this because they never have symptoms ever. But if symptoms do appear without any real treatment, the person suffers organ damage or even dies. Luckily, in Severina's case, when her parasite became active again 30 years later, she was able to receive treatment for the parasite and would make a full recovery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.